Ever wonder what keeps the world's top scientists awake at night? What horror could be so terrible that just a tiny drop could end civilization as we know it? Welcome to the file of SCP-008, a microscopic nightmare that turns ordinary people into something straight out of your worst zombie dreams. This isn't your regular scary story, folks. This is a Class 5 extreme biological hazard, classified as Euclid by the SCP Foundation. That means it's not just dangerous, it's apocalyptic. Right now, deep in secret facilities called G2 sites across the globe, teams of researchers work around the clock to keep this threat contained. Let me paint you a picture of how we handle something this deadly. These G2 sites aren't your average labs. They're fortresses. If anything goes wrong, power failure, communication blackout for 8 hours, even political unrest, everything burns. The whole facility gets cooked with fire and radiation. No evacuation plans, no second chances. And if you work there, hope you like long vacations because you're looking at a 4-month quarantine before you can go home. The story of SCP-008 starts in the blood and chaos of World War II. As armies clashed across the Eastern Front, they disturbed something ancient, something that should have stayed buried. The Battle of Stalingrad wasn't just about soldiers fighting soldiers. Hidden in the ruins, a different kind of war was being fought against an enemy that didn't care which uniform you wore. But here's where it gets weird. The scientists studying this thing say it couldn't have come from Earth. Think about it. A disease this powerful would have taken over long ago. Every animal, every person, everything with blood in its veins would have fallen to it. So where did it come from? The stars? A lab? The truth is buried somewhere in the frozen wastes of history. The Soviets knew how dangerous it was. In 1959, they actually worked with the Foundation to track down these G2 sites and try to wipe this thing out. But after that brief teamwork, radio silence. Nobody knows if Russia still has samples tucked away somewhere, waiting like a loaded gun. What makes SCP-008 so terrifying isn't just what it is. A prion, a twisted protein that corrupts everything it touches. It's what it does. 100% infectious, 100% lethal, no exceptions, no survivors. Unless, well, we'll get to that later. For now, just know that it spreads through any bodily fluid and turns people into something that's not quite dead, not quite alive, and completely unstoppable. The Foundation keeps such tight control over this thing that they even stop research that might accidentally lead to creating it in the future. Think about that. They're not just containing it now. They're trying to prevent it from ever existing again. That's how serious this threat is. Let me tell you about the first signs, the warning that it's too late. It starts like the flu, fever, aches, nothing too scary. But then your mind starts to go. Within 20 hours, you're in a coma, and that's when the real horror show begins. Your body becomes something else, something that shouldn't be possible. Your blood thickens until bullets barely make you bleed. Your muscles get stronger, your need for food disappears. And your brain? Well, that's where the nightmare really begins. But the worst part? The thing that keeps those scientists in their hazmat suits awake at night. This isn't just some mindless virus. It's smart. It keeps just enough of your brain working to hunt, to chase, to spread. And once it has you, only massive head trauma can stop you from becoming part of its ever-growing army. But perhaps the best way to understand the true horror of SCP-008 is through the eyes of those who faced it first. Let me share a story that was buried in the Foundation's archives for decades. A story about Soviet soldiers who stumbled upon something they were never meant to find. The year was 1942. Stalingrad was a frozen hell of bullets and blood. But for Corporal Dmitry Vasilyev and his squad, the real nightmare began when they discovered a mysterious hatch buried in the snow. What happened next would become one of the first documented encounters with SCP-008, and a stark reminder of why the Foundation keeps it locked away. This isn't just another report. This is a first-hand account of what happens when containment fails, when protocols are broken, when humanity faces something it was never meant to understand. Stalingrad was a frozen hell. Snow whipped through the ruins, blanketing the dead and muffling the screams of the living. War was chaos. But this was something else. My name is Corporal Dmitry Vasilyev, and what I'm about to share will sound impossible. But I need you to believe me, because if it happens again, humanity's already lost. It started during a patrol. Command wanted us to sweep the outskirts for supplies and German strongholds. Just another suicide mission, we thought. There were 6 of us. Myself, Sergeant Mikhail Petrov, Private Ivanov, Private Sokolov, Lieutenant Anatoly Markov, and Medic Elena Orlova. Good people, brave people. People who deserved better than what we found. The hatch was buried in a crater, its rusted steel barely visible beneath the snow. "Looks German," Ivanov said, prodding the edge with his rifle. "Or older," Elena muttered, brushing snow off an unfamiliar insignia etched into the metal. A strange, angular design that didn't match any faction we'd encountered. "Command didn't mention this," Mikhail said, his voice tinged with suspicion. Anatoly, ever the pragmatist, shrugged. "Could be supplies, maybe intelligence. Either way, we're checking it out. Open it." The hinges groaned as we forced the hatch open. A rush of stale air hit us, carrying a chemical stench that made my stomach churn. "Jesus," Sokolov muttered, pulling his scarf tighter over his nose. "What died down there?" "Everyone who went in," Elena replied darkly. We descended into the darkness, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The narrow staircase led to a steel corridor lined with reinforced doors. Rust and frost covered everything, but the air grew warmer the deeper we went. Warmer and heavier, like breathing through wet cloth. "This isn't a German bunker," Mikhail said, running his hand over the wall. This is something else." We found the first body at the end of the corridor, or what was left of it. A skeleton, slumped against the wall, wearing a tattered lab coat. The badge pinned to its chest was in German, but the lettering had faded with time. "What the hell were they doing here?" Ivanov asked, his voice shaky. Anatoly ignored him, focusing on the largest door at the end of the hall. A red warning sign adorned it, along with a symbol we didn't recognize. Beneath it, scrawled in blocky Cyrillic, "Biological hazard. Do not open." "Shit," Mikhail muttered. "This isn't supplies." "It could still be valuable," Anatoly insisted. "Open it." "That's a bad idea," Elena said, stepping back. But orders were orders. We forced the door open, revealing a room filled with strange equipment. Vials lined the shelves, each containing a faintly glowing liquid. One of them had cracked, the contents pooling on the floor and giving off that same noxious smell. "What the hell is this?" Sokolov asked, stepping closer. "Looks like some kind of pathogen lab," Elena said, her face pale. She pointed to a diagram pinned to the wall, labeled in German and Cyrillic, SCP-008. Beneath it was a description that made my blood run cold. 100% infectious, 100% lethal. Transmission through bodily fluids and mucous membranes. Symptoms: high fever, dementia, necrosis, coma. And at the bottom, neutralization requires cranial trauma. Elena's voice broke the silence. "This isn't just a bunker. It's a research site. The Germans must have been experimenting with this." She pointed to a faded memo pinned next to the diagram. The writing was in German, but a crude Russian translation had been scribbled in the margins. "Derived from unknown source. Suspected extraterrestrial origin. Highly unstable. Test protocols incomplete." "Extraterrestrial," Ivanov whispered. Mikhail's face darkened. "Doesn't matter where it's from. It's here and it's dangerous. Sokolov shifted uneasily. Why call it SCP-008? What does that mean? Elena shook her head. It's a classification. German scientists probably numbered their projects. The SCP Foundation, if they existed at the time, might have retroactively named it when they cataloged it. She paused, glancing at the vials. Whatever this is, it wasn't meant to stay hidden forever. A crash interrupted her. Sokolov had tripped, knocking over a shelf. A vial shattered, releasing a thin mist into the air. "Don't breathe it!" Elena screamed, pulling her scarf over her face. But the damage was done. The moment we emerged from the bunker, the wind hit us like a slap. I gasped, pulling my scarf down to suck in the freezing air. The chemical stench still clung to us, and no amount of cold could wash it away. Sokolov coughed, a wet hacking sound that echoed in the silence. "Just the dust," he muttered, brushing off our concerned looks. "We need to report this," Elena said, her voice tight. "And quarantine. Whatever was in that vial." "There's no quarantine in a war zone," Anatoly interrupted. "We get back to camp, we tell command, and we keep moving. Understand?" Nobody argued. But as we trudged through the snow, unease settled over us like the frost. Sokolov kept coughing, his face pale and sweat beading on his brow despite the freezing temperatures. Elena stayed close to him, her medical kit ready, but there was little she could do. By the time we reached camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon. Sokolov collapsed as soon as we entered the perimeter, his body convulsing. Elena dropped to her knees beside him, barking orders. "Hold him down, he's seizing." Mikhail and I obeyed, pinning Sokolov's thrashing limbs. His skin was hot to the touch, and when he opened his mouth, a stream of blood-tinged saliva dripped out. "What the fuck is happening to him?" Ivanov asked, his voice high with panic. Elena's face was grim. "He's burning up. Fever's too high. We need to cool him down now." We managed to stabilize him, but barely. His breathing was shallow, his eyes glassy, and his veins stood out against his ashen skin. The rest of us huddled by the fire, the tension thick enough to choke on. "That thing in the bunker," Mikhail said, staring into the flames. "It's in him, isn't it?" "We don't know that," Elena replied sharply, though her expression said otherwise. "And what if it is?" Ivanov asked, his voice trembling. "What do we do then?" Anatoly stood, his face hard. "We do what we have to. Until then, nobody says a word about this. Understood?" Nobody answered. We didn't need to. But deep down, we all knew whatever we'd unleashed, it wasn't going to stop with Sokolov. Sokolov's condition deteriorated overnight. His breathing grew ragged, each exhale a wet rattle that echoed through the frigid stillness of the camp. His fever worsened despite Elena's best efforts to cool him with snow and strips of damp cloth. By dawn, he stopped responding to our voices. "What are we doing, Anatoly?" Mikhail whispered as we stood by the fire. "This isn't a sickness you can treat. You saw what that German chart said." Anatoly's expression remained cold. "We hold position until I say otherwise. We've got no way to move him back to command, and leaving him here is out of the question." "He's already dead," Ivanov said, his voice trembling. "We all know it." Elena stormed over, fury etched into her face. "He's not dead, and I won't stand here while you talk about him like he is. Do you even care that he's one of us?" Ivanov threw up his hands. "Do you care what happens to the rest of us if this thing spreads? Whatever's inside him isn't Sokolov anymore." The argument ended when a guttural groan came from the tent where Sokolov lay. The sound wasn't human. It was low, primal, and hungry. The sound froze us in place. For a moment, none of us moved. Then, slowly, Mikhail reached for his rifle. His eyes locked on the tent flap. "Sokolov!" Elena called out, her voice trembling. The only response was another groan, louder this time. The tent shook slightly, as if something inside was struggling to stand. "Step back," Anatoly ordered, his voice firm. He raised his pistol, aiming at the tent. "If he comes out, we take no chances." "No!" Elena cried, stepping between Anatoly and the tent. You can't just shoot him. He might still be alive. Does that sound alive to you? Ivanov snapped, backing away from the tent. Get out of the way, Elena. Before she could argue, the tent flap burst open. Sokolov staggered out, his movements jerky and unnatural. His skin was gray, patches of it peeling away to reveal necrotic tissue beneath. His eyes were clouded, unfocused, but his mouth twisted into a grotesque snarl as he locked onto us. Oh God, Mikhail muttered, raising his rifle. Sokolov lunged at Elena with inhuman speed. She screamed as he tackled her to the ground, his teeth snapping inches from her face. Anatoly fired, the bullet catching Sokolov in the shoulder, but it didn't slow him down. Aim for the head! I shouted, pulling Elena away as Mikhail fired again. This time, the shot hit Sokolov squarely in the forehead. He collapsed instantly, his body twitching once before going still. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena sat on the ground, trembling, as the rest of us stared at Sokolov's corpse. His blood was thick and dark, barely oozing from the wound. It's the pathogen, Elena whispered, her voice shaking. It's taken over his body. And it's contagious, Anatoly said grimly. If any of us were exposed, we could be next. Ivanov backed away, his face pale. We need to get out of here, burn his body and leave this place. And take this thing back to command, Mikhail countered. What if we're already infected? We could spread it further. Anatoly nodded slowly. We're quarantined here. No one leaves until we're sure it's contained. Are you insane? Ivanov shouted. We'll die here! Better us than the rest of the front, I said quietly, my eyes on Sokolov's lifeless body. None of us wanted to admit it, but we all knew the truth. There was no going back. The hours after Sokolov's death stretched endlessly, filled with silence and tension. The smell of burning flesh hung in the air as we set his body alight, the flames struggling to survive against the icy wind. None of us spoke, but the looks we exchanged said enough. Who would be next? Mikhail broke the silence, his voice a low growl. If this spreads, if any of us are infected. We don't know that yet, Elena cut in sharply. None of us were exposed like he was. We might be fine. Might, Ivanov snapped. That's comforting. You're not helping, Anatoly said, his tone carrying an edge. We're all scared, Ivanov, but panicking will kill us faster than the infection. The words barely settled before Elena doubled over, coughing violently. Everyone froze, hands instinctively reaching for weapons. Elena? I asked hesitantly, taking a step toward her. She waved me off, her breathing ragged. It's nothing, just the smoke. She coughed again, and for a moment I swore her breath was tinged with red. Mikhail wasn't convinced. Bullshit. What if it's starting? She's fine, I snapped, though the doubt in my voice betrayed me. We're all fine. Anatoly stepped between us, his voice cold. Enough. Until we know for sure, no one accuses anyone. We stick together or we die. Got it? The paranoia didn't fade as the night dragged on. Every cough, every twitch, every nervous glance turned into a possible sign of infection. I caught Ivanov watching Elena, his hand hovering near his pistol. Mikhail avoided everyone entirely, keeping to himself by the fire. We can't stay here, Elena whispered to me as we sat a distance from the others. Her voice was weak but steady. Even if we're not infected this place, it's poison. I know, I admitted, but Anatoly's right. If we leave, we risk spreading this. Do you think they'd let us back into camp? She shook her head, her expression grim. If they find out what we've been exposed to, they'll kill us, I finished for her. We both knew it was true. The wind howled outside, drowning out our whispers. Somewhere in the darkness, something groaned faintly. It wasn't Sokolov. We had burned him to ash. This was something else. And it was getting closer. The groaning noise outside didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more guttural, and undeniably close. We huddled together by the dying fire, each of us gripping our weapons as if they might shield us from whatever horror waited in the dark. Anatoly was the first to stand. Whatever's out there isn't going to go away on its own. Mikhail Ivanov, you're with me. Dmitri, stay here with Elena. Keep the fire going. Elena opened her mouth to argue, but stopped when Anatoly gave her a look that brooked no argument. You think it's another infected? Mikhail asked, his voice low. It's not a wolf, Anatoly replied, cocking his rifle. And if it's anything like Sokolov, we can't let it live. The three of them disappeared into the night, their footsteps crunching over the frost. I stayed with Elena, staring into the fire. Neither of us spoke. The weight of our situation had silenced us both. Minutes passed like hours. The groaning outside stopped, replaced by the sound of sporadic gunfire in the distance. My stomach twisted with every shot. Were they winning? Were they already dead? What if they don't come back? Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. They will, I said, though I didn't believe it. Anatoly always comes back. She didn't respond. Her hand tightened around the handle of her knife, her knuckles white. For the first time, I noticed the faint sheen of sweat on her forehead, despite the cold. Elena, are you... A blood-curdling scream cut me off. It wasn't from the distance. It was close. Horribly close. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't Anatoly, Mikhail, or Ivanov. It came from just outside the tent. I raised my rifle, motioning for Elena to stay behind me. She didn't argue. The flap of the tent moved slightly, the fabric swaying as something brushed against it. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the canvas. Who's there? I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound steady. There was no answer, only the faint sound of breathing, wet and labored. My finger hovered over the trigger, sweat dripping into my eyes. Then the flap tore open. A figure lunged at me, its movements wild and erratic. I fired instinctively, the shot illuminating the tent for a split second. The thing, whatever it was, crumpled to the ground, but it didn't stay down. It writhed, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it tried to rise again. Elena screamed, plunging her knife into its neck. Blackened blood spurted out, thick and sluggish, coating her hands. I fired again, this time aiming for its head. The creature fell still, its body twitching one final time before collapsing. We stood there, panting, staring at the thing on the ground. It was human once, or at least it had been. Its face was contorted, the skin mottled and decaying. Its eyes were clouded, its mouth twisted into a permanent snarl. It's spreading, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. We're not safe here. Before I could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps approached the tent. Anatoly burst inside, his face pale. We need to move, he said, his voice urgent. Now! What happened? I asked. He glanced at the corpse on the ground, his expression hardening. There's more of them. A lot more. Anatoly's words hit like a hammer. More of them. My chest tightened as I glanced at Elena, her pale face smeared with dark blood. She didn't look ready to run, but we didn't have a choice. Grab whatever you can carry, Anatoly ordered. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed his fear. We're leaving now. What about Mikhail and Ivanov? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. They're gone, he said flatly. We move, or we end up like them. Elena hesitated, gripping her knife like it was a lifeline. And go where? We're surrounded, Anatoly. There's a supply depot a few kilometers east, he said. If we make it there, we might be able to radio for help. And lead this thing back to command? I snapped. You saw what Sokolov became. You think we should risk the entire front? Do you want to die here? Anatoly growled, stepping closer. Because that's your other option. We moved into the night, the bitter wind cutting through our coats. The distant groans and snarls followed us, a constant reminder that we weren't alone. Every shadow felt alive. Every sound a threat. Elena stumbled beside me, her breath labored. "Dmitri," she whispered, her voice barely audible. If I turn." "You're not going to turn," I said firmly, though the knot in my stomach tightened with every word. "We're going to get through this." She didn't reply, but I saw the doubt in her eyes. The first attack came an hour later. We were crossing an open field when they came out of the trees, 3 of them, moving faster than anything that decayed flesh had a right to move. "Contact!" Anatoly shouted, raising his rifle. I fired before he finished speaking, the first shot catching one of the creatures in the chest. It barely staggered. I adjusted my aim, my second shot hitting it between the eyes. It dropped instantly. The others weren't so easy. Elena screamed as one lunged at her, its blackened teeth snapping inches from her face. She swung her knife wildly, slashing at its throat. Dark blood sprayed across her. But the thing didn't stop. "Head!" Anatoly barked, firing twice in quick succession. The creature collapsed, twitching violently before finally going still. The third was on me before I could react, its claw-like hands tearing at my coat. Its strength was inhuman. I fell backward, my rifle skittering out of reach. Anatoly's boot connected with its head, sending it sprawling. "Get up!" he snarled, pulling me to my feet. I grabbed my rifle and fired, the shot echoing in the night. The creature's head snapped back, and it fell. We reached the depot just before dawn, the skeletal building offering little comfort. The groans were closer now, the sound of countless bodies dragging themselves toward us. "We won't hold them off," Elena said, her voice trembling. "There are too many." "Then we make it count," Anatoly said, setting his rifle on a broken crate. "We give command the time they need to prepare." I wanted to argue, but the truth was undeniable. We weren't leaving this place. The first wave hit as the sun rose, the creatures swarming from all sides. We fired until our rifles overheated, each shot driving them back for only a moment. Their blood painted the snow black, the air thick with the stench of decay. Elena screamed as one broke through the line, its claws raking across her arm. I shot it in the head, but it was too late. Her eyes met mine, wide with terror. "Do it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I hesitated, my hands shaking. "Elena." "Do it!" she screamed, lunging toward me. The shot echoed louder than the rest. Her body crumpled, the knife falling from her hand. By the time the second wave came, it was just me and Anatoly. The depot was a graveyard, the snow littered with bodies, human and otherwise. "I'm out," Anatoly said, tossing his rifle aside. He pulled his knife, his jaw set. "We end this here." I nodded, gripping my own blade tightly. The creatures came in waves, their screams drowning out my thoughts. I didn't feel the first bite, or the second. All I felt was the cold. When command found the depot days later, they didn't find survivors. Just a pile of ash and twisted bodies. The report was clear. Containment failed. SCP-008 breached. This has been the story of SCP-008, the zombie plague that makes The Walking Dead look like a gentle fairy tale. Let's dive into the rabbit hole of what we really know about SCP-008. And what keeps Foundation researchers up at night theorizing about this nightmare of nature, or whatever created it. First up, where did it come from? The Foundation's pretty sure it's not from Earth, and they've got good reasons. Think about it. A disease this powerful, this perfect at what it does, would have taken over long ago. Our entire ecosystem would be different if something like SCP-008 evolved naturally here. This thing is engineered, whether by alien hands or something else we don't understand. Here's what we know for sure. The first major encounters happened during World War II. The Eastern Front wasn't just a battleground between armies. It became ground zero for something much worse. Those G2 sites, they were old, really old. Someone built them long before the war. Someone knew this thing needed to be contained. Then there's the alternate reality angle. In one timeline, SCP-008 gets loose in 2092 and causes something called the Great Zombie Plague. Another reality had it running wild in the American West, with a Native American who could carry it without showing symptoms. Imagine that. A walking apocalypse who didn't even know they were infected. The really scary theory. Some researchers think SCP-008 isn't just a disease, it's a weapon. Look at how it works. It keeps the body functioning even after death. It makes you stronger, harder to kill. Your blood gets so thick bullets barely slow you down. You don't need food. You don't feel pain. And most importantly, you spread the infection. Perfect for clearing out an area without destroying the infrastructure. But here's the twist that makes scientists scratch their heads. Why make it so obvious? If this is a weapon, it's not subtle. The infected are clearly dangerous. They're easy to spot. A truly perfect bioweapon would be invisible until it's too late. So either whoever made SCP-008 wanted us to know what we were fighting, or this isn't its final form. Some theorists point to Test 914-01103, where putting a normal corpse through SCP-914 on the fine setting produced an SCP-008 infected body. What does that tell us? Maybe SCP-008 isn't just a disease. Maybe it's a fundamental pattern in reality, something that exists as a possibility waiting to happen. The Russian connection is interesting too. That brief collaboration in 1959, the Foundation and the USSR working together, that doesn't happen unless both sides are terrified of something worse than each other. And after that, radio silence. Nobody knows if Russia still has samples. Nobody knows what they learned during their time studying it. Let's break down what makes SCP-008 truly terrifying from a scientific perspective. This isn't just another zombie virus. It's a prion, a misfolded protein that can convert other proteins into copies of itself. But normal prions don't work like this. They don't give you superpowers. They don't keep your body running after death. This thing rewrites the rules of biology. The fact that SCP-500 can cure it, that's huge. It means the changes aren't permanent. Everything SCP-008 does to a body can be undone. But that raises another question. If someone designed this thing, did they also design the cure? And if so, why make just a handful of pills instead of mass-producing the antidote? Here's my favorite theory. SCP-008 is a test. Someone, or something, is watching how we handle it. Do we try to use it as a weapon? Do we work together to contain it? Do we give in to panic or rise above our fears? Maybe those G2 sites aren't just containment facilities. Maybe they're assessment centers monitoring how ready we are for whatever comes next. But at the end of the day, we're left with more questions than answers. What we know for sure is this. SCP-008 exists. It's contained, but barely. And if it ever gets loose, well, all those zombie apocalypse movies you've watched, they might turn out to be training videos. Sleep tight, viewers. And if you ever find a strange bunker in the snow, do yourself a favor. Leave it buried.